Let me ask you something. Have you ever been told you've already lived your best days? That you've peaked, and from here on, it's all downhill? What if I told you they were wrong? Completely wrong. I mean it. Trust me on this. This story isn't just about proving someone else wrong. It's about discovering a power inside you that even you forgot you had. So stay with me, because what happens next might just change how you see your own life. The clinking of crystal glasses rang through the glittering ballroom, each delicate chime a note in the symphony of wealth and vanity. 100 chandeliers rained light down on gold-trimmed tables, casting a warm glow over Manhattan's most powerful players. Politicians, moguls, and socialites swirled in expensive gowns and tuxedos, their laughter a low, calculated hum. At the center of it all stood Daniel Carter, my ex-husband, looking every inch the king he believed himself to be. At 40, with silver just beginning to streak his thick dark hair, he wore his arrogance like a tailored suit. He was holding court near the Champagne Tower, his voice booming over the music as he spun yet another exaggerated story about his own greatness. His hand rested casually on the hip of a tall, willowy brunette in a dress so sheer it might as well have been painted on. "See, the thing about Monica," Daniel was saying to the group of investors gathered around him, "is she's not afraid to be ambitious. She's young, driven, a woman who's still on her way up. Not like," he chuckled, swirling the golden liquid in his glass before delivering the blow. "Not like my ex, she peaked at 30. There was a ripple of polite, slightly uncomfortable laughter. But Daniel didn't stop. He never did. "Don't get me wrong," he added with a smirk. "She was beautiful back then. But time is cruel to women. You know how it is." I wasn't in the room yet, but I could feel the moment in my bones, the way some people can sense an oncoming storm. For years, Daniel had been cutting me down behind my back, twisting the truth, turning our marriage into a punchline for his own ego. Back when I was his wife, I'd ignored the little digs, the public jokes, the way he'd compare me to younger women at parties. I'd told myself it didn't matter. But it did, and he knew it. Daniel's downfall began the moment he underestimated me. 5 years ago, I was just another discarded wife. Our divorce had been brutal, not in court, but in spirit. He hadn't cheated in the obvious sense. No, his betrayal was quieter, more insidious. It was the way he began erasing me from our life before I was even gone. The way he stopped asking about my work, stopped noticing the details, stopped looking at me like I was the woman he'd once chased halfway across the country. By the time he filed for divorce, I was just a ghost in our home, a silent figure cooking his meals while he scrolled through his phone. And when it was over, he made sure to tell everyone how he had traded up. The truth was, after the divorce, I disappeared. On purpose. While Daniel paraded Monica through every social event in the city, I quietly rebuilt my life. I moved abroad for a while. Europe, Asia, consulting for companies that most people couldn't even name but that controlled entire industries. My work was quiet but powerful. I invested. I learned. And one day, I met someone who saw me not as an accessory to his ambition, but as an equal. His name was Adrian Blake, a self-made billionaire with a reputation for both brilliance and ruthless precision in business. He was nothing like Daniel. Adrian didn't need to talk over people to prove his worth. He didn't need to flash his bank account to command respect. His power was silent, steady, and undeniable. And for reasons I still can't fully explain, he chose me. When Adrian and I married, we kept it small. No press, no society pages, just a ceremony in a private villa overlooking the Amalfi Coast. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about partnership. But tonight was different. The invitation had arrived weeks ago, the Carter Foundation annual gala. My first instinct had been to toss it in the trash, but Adrian had looked at it, then looked at me and smiled in that knowing way of his. "Go," he said. "Go remind him exactly who you are." So I went. As I stood outside the ballroom doors now, the murmur of conversations spilling through the cracks, my heart was steady. I wasn't here for revenge, not exactly. I was here to reclaim the narrative Daniel had stolen. The maitre d' spotted me immediately, his posture straightening as if he sensed that I was not just another guest. "Mrs. Blake," he said, bowing slightly, "your husband is already inside." I nodded, adjusting the sweep of my floor-length black gown. It was simple but devastating, a custom piece from a Parisian designer that fit me like it had been poured onto my skin. My hair was pulled into a sleek chignon, diamond drop earrings catching the light. Every detail was deliberate. Every choice a silent declaration. I have not peaked, I have only begun. When the double doors opened, the room shifted. Heads turned. Conversations faltered. The sound of my heels on the marble floor was like a drumbeat in the sudden quiet. I saw Daniel freeze mid-sentence, his glass halfway to his lips. His eyes widened just enough for me to see the crack in his composure before he pasted on a smile. But it wasn't Daniel's reaction that mattered most. It was Monica's. She glanced at me, then at the man walking at my side. Adrian Blake. Billionaire. Powerhouse. The kind of man even Daniel had once spoken of with begrudging respect. Adrian was in a perfectly tailored midnight blue tuxedo, his hand resting lightly on the small of my back, his gaze fixed only on me as if I were the only person in the room. We stopped just a few feet from Daniel. I let the silence stretch, the weight of the moment pressing down on every pair of watching eyes. Finally, I smiled. Not the brittle smile I'd worn during our last years together, but a real one. "Daniel," I said softly, "it's been a while." His jaw worked, but no words came out. Adrian extended a hand toward him, his voice calm but firm. Adrian Blake. Her husband. The word husband landed like a gavel in the still air. And in that moment, with every camera phone in the room tilted in our direction, I knew exactly how this night was going to end. Because tonight, Daniel was going to learn that the woman he thought had peaked at 30 had just walked back into his life at the top of her game. And she wasn't here to play nice. Before I ever became Mrs. Blake, before I learned what it meant to walk into a room with quiet power, I was just Emily Parker, from a little coastal town in Maine. Our town wasn't the kind of place you found on postcards. No fancy boardwalks, no yachts bobbing in a glittering harbor. We had working docks, chipped paint on our homes, and neighbors who knew everyone's business whether you liked it or not. My father was a fisherman, gone before dawn most mornings, weather-beaten and stubborn as the tide. My mother worked part-time at the library, a soft-spoken woman who taught me the value of listening before speaking. Money was always tight, but my parents believed in education like it was the ticket to another world. They pushed me to study hard, to dream bigger than our shoreline. I was the first in my family to go to college, a scholarship kid at a state university, majoring in marketing because it seemed practical. That's where I first started believing I could build something for myself, that I could rise above where I started. But life has a way of humbling you just when you think you're getting somewhere. It was at a friend's rooftop birthday party in Boston that I met Daniel Carter. He was already magnetic back then. Tall, well-dressed, with a laugh that pulled you in. I remember thinking he looked like he belonged in a magazine. He was 7 years older, working in corporate finance, and he had that confident ease of someone who'd never had to wonder where his next rent check was coming from. Daniel zeroed in on me that night. I didn't understand why at first. I wasn't the flashiest woman there, not the loudest, not the one in designer heels. But he said he liked that about me, that I seemed real, in a city full of people trying to be someone else. He bought me a drink, asked about my life, and when I told him about my small town, he grinned. "So you're the kind of woman who knows how to work hard. I like that." We started dating. I was still juggling 2 part-time jobs, a receptionist at a marketing agency during the day, a waitress at night, while he took me to restaurants where the bill for 2 was more than my rent. At first I felt out of place, but Daniel had a way of making me feel chosen, like I'd been plucked from obscurity into a better life. Looking back, I can see the warning signs. How he always insisted on picking the restaurants, the vacations, even the clothes he thought looked best on me. How he would give compliments that had sharp edges. "You look beautiful when you wear your hair like that," hides those lines by your eyes. I laughed them off. I told myself he was just teasing. When he proposed, I said yes without hesitation. My parents were thrilled. They thought I'd found a man who could give me the stability they'd worked so hard for but never had. And for a while, it seemed true. We bought a condo in the city. I quit my waitress job. Daniel said I didn't have to worry about money anymore, that I could focus on being a wife. At first, that felt like a blessing. I started a small consulting business from home, helping local shops with their marketing. But Daniel didn't take it seriously. He called it my little hobby. When I'd land a new client, he'd smile politely, but he never asked how the work went. Slowly, without even realizing it, I began to shrink. My world became his world, his friends, his events, his routines. The cracks started showing in our third year of marriage. Daniel's hours got longer. He traveled more. When he was home, he was glued to his phone. I tried to talk to him about it, but he'd brush me off. "Don't start," he'd say, pouring himself another drink. "You wouldn't understand the pressure I'm under." What I didn't see then, what I couldn't admit, was that I had built my life entirely around a man who was already preparing to walk away. One night, after he'd been gone on a business trip for a week, I found a hotel receipt in his jacket pocket. The dates matched the trip, but the hotel was in the city, not Chicago, where he said he'd been. When I confronted him, he laughed. Told me I was being paranoid, that the receipt was from a client meeting months ago. And I believed him. Or maybe I just wanted to. By the time I turned 30, the quiet doubts had become a constant hum in my head. But I still clung to the marriage, thinking that if I worked harder, looked better, became more interesting, maybe he'd see me again. Maybe he'd love me the way he used to. The end came suddenly, like a storm that had been brewing just out of sight. Daniel sat me down one Saturday morning, no warning, no softness in his tone, and said, "I think we should divorce. We want different things." There was no fight, no begging, just a cold decision already made. And then came the final twist of the knife. Within weeks, he was parading a much younger woman around at all the places we used to go. People whispered, some pitied me, others smirked like they'd seen this coming all along. Daniel didn't just move on. He rewrote the story, painting me as the woman who had let herself go, who had nothing going on in her life, who had peaked at 30. I didn't fight his version of events. I didn't have the strength. Instead, I did what no one expected. I left the city, I sold the condo, I took the remnants of my savings and disappeared. For the first time in years, I was alone with no one's opinion to answer to but my own. And that's when something inside me shifted. I realized I had spent a decade making myself small to fit into Daniel's life. Now I was going to make myself whole again, and bigger than he ever imagined. I didn't know it then, but my disappearance was the start of a journey that would take me halfway across the world, into boardrooms I never dreamed I'd enter, and straight into the path of the man who would become my true partner. And when I finally returned, it wouldn't be as the woman Daniel discarded. It would be as the woman he could never touch again. The Carter Foundation annual gala was the kind of night Daniel used to call our season opener. Back when I was still his wife, this event marked the start of a whirlwind calendar of dinners, auctions, and charity balls. I remembered standing at these same doors years ago, my hands smoothing a dress I'd borrowed from a friend, praying no one would notice the frayed seams. Back then, I'd been just another plus one, smiling politely while Daniel networked. Tonight, everything was different. The Metropolitan Grand Hotel's ballroom was a masterpiece in marble and gold. Crystal chandeliers cascaded light onto a sea of glittering gowns and black tuxedos. Towering floral arrangements, imported from Paris, bloomed in every corner, filling the air with the scent of roses and orchids. Waiters in white gloves glided between tables carrying trays of champagne, their movements as rehearsed as a ballet. It wasn't just an event, it was a display of power. Every detail screamed money, influence, and exclusivity. Daniel had chosen this space deliberately. It was a place where he could be seen, admired, and envied. And as I quickly realized, it was also the perfect stage for me to make my return. The moment I stepped in, conversations dipped just enough for me to feel the shift. The room didn't know yet why my face looked familiar, but they would. People in these circles always remembered a scandal, even if they couldn't recall the exact headlines. At my side, Adrian was the picture of composed authority. He didn't need to announce who he was. Everyone knew him, or at least knew of him. The whispers started as soon as the first person recognized him. "Adrian Blake is here. Who's she?" We moved through the crowd with a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant. I could feel eyes on me, scanning the details, the gown, the diamonds, the way Adrian's hand rested on my back. I let them look. Every step I took was measured, deliberate. Years ago, I'd walked 2 steps behind Daniel at this gala. Tonight, I walked side by side with a man who treated me like his equal. The decor hadn't changed much since I'd last been here. Same gilded columns, same string quartet playing softly in the corner, same auction stage draped in navy velvet. But my perspective was entirely new. Where I used to see barriers, the unspoken hierarchy of wealth and status, I now saw opportunity. I understood the language of these rooms, and I knew exactly how to command them. Daniel was easy to spot. He stood near the stage, surrounded by investors and board members, his arm casually draped around Monica's waist. She looked young enough to be deciding on her college major, though her gown suggested she was fluent in the art of being kept. As Adrian and I approached the champagne table, I caught a flash of recognition in Daniel's eyes from across the room. For a fraction of a second, his expression faltered. Then, like the skilled performer he was, he smoothed it into that practiced smile, the one that had charmed so many people into overlooking his flaws. Adrian leaned in slightly, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "He's seen you. Don't rush. Let him come to you." I smiled, because Adrian was right. Tonight wasn't about storming over and making a scene. It was about control. The very thing Daniel used to have over me and had lost the moment I walked away. We took a seat at one of the VIP tables near the front. From here, I could see the entire room. The MC was working the stage, introducing speakers and highlighting the charity's work. Cameras flashed from the press area, catching shots of celebrities, business leaders, and, occasionally, us. I knew those photos would be online before midnight, and I didn't mind one bit. I thought back to my first gala here with Daniel. I'd worn a pale blue dress that looked better on the hanger than it did on me. The zipper had stuck halfway up, and I'd spent the night afraid someone would notice. Daniel hadn't stayed at my side once. He'd made his rounds while I clung to a glass of champagne like it was a lifeline, smiling until my cheeks ached. Now I was in a gown that fit like a second skin, custom made in Milan. My jewelry wasn't borrowed. My confidence wasn't either. And the man beside me wasn't looking over my shoulder for someone younger, flashier, or more useful to his career. Adrian's presence was a quiet shield, but I didn't need protection from Daniel anymore. I was here for myself. At one point, the auctioneer announced the next item up for bidding, a private week-long stay at a Tuscan villa, complete with a personal chef and wine cellar access. Adrian lifted his paddle without hesitation, outbidding a hedge fund manager by a margin so wide the crowd gasped. The auctioneer's hammer fell, and Adrian turned to me with a smile that said, "I told you we'd have fun tonight." But I noticed Daniel watching from the corner of his eye. Monica whispered something to him, and his jaw tightened. The speeches began, and the host invited Daniel to the stage to present a special award to a major donor. He straightened his tuxedo, kissed Monica's cheek, and strode up the steps. His voice filled the room as he spoke about generosity, legacy, and vision, the same words he'd used a dozen times before. Then, mid-sentence, his gaze flicked toward me. Just for an instant, I could see the question in his eyes, "What are you doing here?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. My very presence was the answer. The applause came, polite but not thunderous. As Daniel stepped down from the stage, our eyes met fully for the first time in years. I saw recognition there, and something else. Not regret exactly, more like the dawning realization that he'd miscalculated. He didn't come over right away. Instead, he circled the room, shaking hands, pretending not to notice me while making sure I didn't leave. It was a tactic I knew well. Give yourself a moment to collect your thoughts before the confrontation. The music swelled again. The lights dimmed slightly as the staff prepared for dinner service. Adrian reached for my hand under the table, his fingers warm against mine. "You're doing perfectly," he murmured, and I realized he was right. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't bracing for impact. I was in control. Across the room, Daniel finally started walking toward us. And that's when I decided exactly how this first conversation was going to go. And it wouldn't be anything he expected. Daniel Carter had always been the kind of man people noticed, even in a crowded room. At 6'2", with broad shoulders and that easy politician's smile, he knew how to turn charm into currency. From the outside, he was the picture of success. The polished suit, the expensive watch, the confident handshake that lingered just long enough to make you feel important. But Daniel's charm was like champagne. It sparkled at first, but if you left it out long enough, it went flat. I used to think his ambition was something to admire. When we first met, he was working long hours at a mid-tier investment firm, dreaming of making partner before 40. He'd talk about his goals with such passion that I believed every word. I wanted to believe. It felt good to be part of someone's grand plan, to think we were building a future together. The truth was, Daniel's ambition wasn't about building something lasting. It was about climbing as high as he could, as fast as he could, no matter who he stepped on along the way. In the early years, his manipulations were subtle. A dig disguised as a joke, a decision made without asking me, then explained as if my opinion had been irrelevant all along. He didn't outright forbid me from working, but he made it clear he thought my business ventures were distractions. "Why bother?" he'd say, half laughing. "You've already got me. Let me handle the money." When things were going well for him, he could be generous, in a way that looked good to other people. He'd buy me a necklace after a big deal closed, not because he thought I'd like it, but because he knew the firm's partners' wives would see it at the next dinner. His kindness was always performative. But when things weren't going well, that's when the real Daniel surfaced. He had a temper, sharp and controlled, the kind that didn't shout but cut you down with precision. He'd say things like, "Do you even hear yourself?" Or, "No wonder no one takes you seriously." And he'd say them in that calm, reasonable tone that made me question whether I was overreacting. His public image, though, was flawless. He had a knack for making everyone in the room feel like the most important person there. Waiters remembered his name, valets remembered his car, and colleagues remembered his toasts. The ones he gave with a glass raised high, a perfect story on his lips, and just enough self-deprecation to make him seem human. Daniel thrived on being admired. But admiration wasn't enough. He needed to be envied. That's why Monica was perfect for him. She wasn't just younger. She was a status symbol. She posted their vacations on social media, tagged luxury brands, made sure their life together looked like a magazine spread. Daniel didn't just want love. He wanted a billboard announcing his worth to the world. When he left me, he didn't just move on. He erased me. It was as if our years together had been a warm-up act for the real Daniel. He told mutual friends I'd lost my spark, that I'd stopped trying. I even overheard one of his business associates say, "She's nice, but she peaked at 30. I didn't have to guess where that line came from. Standing in the gala ballroom now, watching him work the crowd, I could still read the micro-expressions on his face. The tilt of his head when he was pretending to be interested. The subtle narrowing of his eyes when he was sizing someone up. The way his smile tightened whenever someone else stole the spotlight. Daniel approached our table with Monica still on his arm, her perfume arriving a second before she did. His voice was warm, but I could hear the strain under it. "Emily," he said, leaning in just enough to make it look affectionate for anyone watching. What a surprise. I tilted my head slightly, letting my gaze flick to Monica before meeting his eyes. "Daniel?" I didn't offer more. Adrian rose smoothly from his chair, offering his hand. "Adrian Blake," he said, "her husband." The handshake between them was brief but loaded. Adrian's grip was steady, firm without being aggressive. Daniel's was tighter, a shade too long, the kind of handshake that tries to reclaim dominance. Monica's eyes darted between us, a faint line forming between her brows. "We didn't know you'd be here," she said, her voice light but with an edge. "I'm sure you didn't," I replied, my smile never wavering. Daniel shifted, clearly trying to regain control of the moment. "Well, you look different. Good. I mean, it's been, 5 years?" "Almost," I said. "Feels like a lifetime ago." His eyes narrowed just slightly. "And now you're—" He glanced at Adrian. "Happy," I said, before Adrian could speak. "Very happy." It wasn't the words themselves that unsettled him. It was the ease with which I said them. Back when we were married, he could sense my emotions like a shark senses blood in the water. Now I gave him nothing. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight. "We should catch up later," he said. "Talk about old times." I met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Old times," I echoed. "Yes, let's." He walked away then, but I knew that wasn't the end. Men like Daniel didn't just let go. If he couldn't win you back, he had to at least prove you weren't better off without him. I watched him blend back into the crowd, smiling for cameras, his arm wrapped around Monica like she was the prize he'd been chasing all along. But I also saw something else, the quick glances over his shoulder, the way his posture shifted whenever he caught sight of me. And in that moment, I realized Daniel wasn't just surprised to see me. He was afraid of what I might do next. The dinner service had barely begun when the evening took a turn. From our table near the stage, I could see Daniel moving from group to group, shaking hands, leaning in to whisper things that made people laugh a little too loudly. Monica trailed behind him, all practiced smiles and perfect posture, the human equivalent of a designer handbag meant to be shown off. The MC announced the next portion of the evening. A live pledge drive for the charity's new children's hospital wing. Donors would stand, state their name, and announce their contribution. It was part generosity, part theater, and everyone knew it. Daniel loved this part. Sure enough, when the microphone reached him, he rose with that politician's smile. "Daniel Carter," he said, his voice carrying. "The Carter Foundation pledges $100,000 to this important cause." The room applauded politely. Monica clapped daintily, leaning in to kiss his cheek for the cameras. Daniel basked in it, the way he always did. The microphone began to make its way around the room, donor after donor announcing their amounts. Then, without warning, Adrian stood. The suddenness of his movement drew every eye. "Adrian Blake," he said, his voice even but firm, "and my wife, Emily Blake, will match the Carter Foundation's pledge and triple it." There was a collective gasp, followed by a ripple of murmurs. Heads turned. Cameras swung toward us like metal to a magnet. I could feel Daniel's eyes burning into me from across the room. Adrian sat back down, as if nothing monumental had just happened, taking a sip of his wine. I kept my expression calm, my hands resting lightly on the tablecloth. Daniel, on the other hand, looked like someone had just stolen his spotlight, because that's exactly what had happened. When the applause died down, the MC continued, but the energy in the room had shifted. Conversations buzzed. People glanced at me with curiosity, the kind that said they were recalculating everything they thought they knew about Daniel Carter's ex-wife. Dinner plates arrived, roasted lamb with truffle potatoes, but I barely tasted it. I could feel the tension building like static in the air. I didn't have to wait long for it to spark. Halfway through the main course, Daniel approached our table. He didn't bother waiting for a natural pause in conversation. He just stepped in, his hand resting on the back of my chair, in a move that was both possessive and intrusive. "Emily," he said, his smile tight. "A word?" Adrian's eyes flicked to mine. I gave the smallest nod. "Of course," I said, rising from my seat. Daniel led me toward a quieter corner near the bar, though it was still within sight of half the room. He didn't seem to realize, or maybe he didn't care, that his voice carried farther than he thought. "What are you doing?" he hissed, the warmth gone from his tone. "Supporting a good cause," I said evenly. "Isn't that what tonight is about?" "Don't play games with me, Emily. You and your husband just made me look small," I offered, my eyebrow arching, his jaw clenched. "You think this is some kind of revenge stunt?" I leaned in slightly, my voice soft but cutting. "Daniel, I don't need to make you look bad. You've been doing that all on your own." His nostrils flared, but before he could respond, Monica appeared. "Everything okay here?" she asked, her tone sugary with just a hint of steel. "Just fine," I said, turning to face her fully. I was congratulating Daniel on his generous donation. It's wonderful to see him so committed to the cause. Her eyes narrowed, but she pasted on a smile. "Yes, well, we all do what we can." The implication was clear. She wanted me to know my place. I smiled in return, tilting my head. "Some of us do a little more than that." A flicker of something, irritation, maybe even insecurity, crossed her face. I could tell she wasn't used to anyone challenging her, especially not in public. Daniel stepped between us slightly, trying to control the narrative. "Emily, enjoy your evening," he said, his tone clipped. "Oh, I will," I replied. "And Daniel?" He turned back, wary. "Be careful who you underestimate. You never know when they might surprise you." I walked away without waiting for a response, the click of my heels punctuating each step. I didn't need to look back to know they were both watching me. When I returned to the table, Adrian was in easy conversation with the CEO of a major tech firm. He looked up, reading my face in an instant. "Everything good?" "Better than good," I said, taking my seat. "I think I just rattled a cage." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of polite conversation and stolen glances across the room. Daniel didn't approach me again, but I caught him watching more than once. Monica clung to him a little tighter, laughed a little louder. Classic tells of someone trying to stake a claim. By the time dessert was served, the buzz in the room had shifted entirely. The talk wasn't about the charity anymore. It was about Adrian and me, about the unexpected power couple who just outbid Daniel Carter and made him look like a man out of his league. The event wound down and people began to drift toward the exit. Adrian and I lingered, saying our goodbyes. As we stepped into the cool night air, a voice called after me, "Emily." I turned to see Daniel standing just outside the ballroom doors, his tie slightly loosened, a strange mix of frustration and curiosity in his eyes. "Walk with me," he said. I glanced at Adrian. He gave me a subtle nod, not permission, but trust. I followed Daniel a few steps down the sidewalk, the city lights casting long shadows around us. He shoved his hands into his pockets, an old habit he'd never broken. "You've changed," he said finally. I met his gaze, unflinching. "Yes, and that's the point." He studied me for a long moment, as if searching for some trace of the woman he used to control. He wouldn't find her. "Why are you really here, Emily?" he asked. And that's when I decided it was time to tell him. Not everything, not yet, but just enough to make him realize his world was about to change. The city was quiet by the time Adrian and I returned to our penthouse. The streets below were dotted with pools of light from street lamps, the kind of stillness that made the chaos of the gala feel like it had happened in another lifetime. Adrian closed the door behind us, setting his keys in the dish by the entryway. "You handled yourself perfectly tonight," he said, his voice warm. I smiled faintly, but the truth was my chest felt tight. I crossed the living room, letting my gown trail behind me as I sank into the couch. "It didn't feel perfect," I admitted. "It felt unfinished." He studied me for a moment, then loosened his tie and sat across from me. "You knew this wouldn't all be wrapped up in one night." Daniel's pride took a hit, yes, but he's not the kind of man who walks away quietly. I looked down at my hands, still clasped in my lap. That's the part that worries me. For hours at the gala, I had been unshakable, every smile calculated, every step confident. But sitting here now, in the safety of my own home, the cracks began to show. My mind kept replaying Daniel's voice, low and sharp in that corner by the bar. "What are you doing?" It wasn't just a question. It was a warning. Adrian reached for my hand. "You've built a life without him. He can't take that away." I wanted to believe that. But I knew Daniel better than anyone. His need for control wasn't limited to the boardroom or his public image. It seeped into every corner of his life, and he'd never been able to stand the idea of someone walking away on their own terms. Especially me. That night, long after Adrian had gone to bed, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. The skyline glittered like it was holding its breath. My reflection stared back at me, the woman I'd fought to become, polished, strong, untouchable. But behind her eyes was the echo of the woman I used to be. I hated that she was still there. The next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Adrian Blake and wife outbid Carter Foundation at annual gala. The photos were sharp and unforgiving. Me standing tall beside Adrian, Daniel in the background with a look that could curdle milk. Social media was alive with speculation. Some congratulated us for our generosity. Others whispered about the tension in the room. By mid-morning, my phone was buzzing with messages from numbers I hadn't seen in years. Old acquaintances, society gossips, even a reporter pretending to be an old friend. I ignored them all, until one message came through that stopped me cold. It was from Daniel. Just 3 words. "We need to talk." I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone down. Adrian noticed my silence over breakfast. "Daniel?" he guessed. I nodded. "He wants to talk." He leaned back, sipping his coffee. "To you?" I hesitated. Part of me does. Part of me wants to look him in the eye and tell him exactly what I think of him. And part of me. I trailed off, ashamed of the truth that was trying to surface. "Part of you still hears his voice when you doubt yourself," Adrian finished quietly. I swallowed hard. Yes. Adrian reached across the table, covering my hand with his. Then maybe it's time you hear your own voice louder. That day, I tried to focus on work. My calendar was full, meetings, calls, plans for an upcoming project in Singapore. But no matter how busy I kept, Daniel's shadow lingered. By late afternoon, I found myself staring out the office window, lost in a memory I hadn't revisited in years. It was the night after Daniel first told me he wanted a divorce. I'd stayed up until sunrise, sitting on the kitchen floor, clutching a coffee mug like it was the only solid thing in my world. I'd felt small, discarded, replaceable. That was the night I decided I had to disappear, because I couldn't bear the idea of staying where I wasn't wanted. Now, 5 years later, I wasn't that woman anymore. But Daniel's sudden reappearance had unearthed her, and she was whispering doubts I thought I'd buried. By evening, I caved. I texted him back. 1 hour. Public place. We met at a quiet hotel lounge, the kind with leather chairs and soft jazz humming in the background. Daniel was already there when I arrived, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He stood as I approached, that same calculating smile on his face. "Emily," he said, as if tasting the name. "You look well?" I sat without responding. "You wanted to talk." He leaned back, studying me. "You've changed. I'm not sure if it's for the better." I raised an eyebrow. "That's not your call to make." He smirked, taking a slow sip. "You always did like to think you were in control. But let's be honest, this new life of yours, it's just another version of what I gave you." The words hit harder than I expected. He knew exactly where to aim. "I built my life without you," I said, my voice steady. "But you wouldn't even know how to play in this world if it wasn't for me," he replied, his tone soft, almost sympathetic. "I made you relevant, Emily. You can't change that." It was the same old Daniel, dressing insults up as truths, daring me to question myself. And for a flicker of a moment, I felt it, that familiar pull, the instinct to defend myself, to prove him wrong. I stood, smoothing my coat. "You didn't make me, Daniel. You underestimated me. And that's the difference." He tilted his head, his smile thin. "We'll see." I walked out without looking back, but his words clung to me like smoke. That night, I lay awake beside Adrian, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing. I told myself Daniel's opinion didn't matter, that he had no power over me anymore. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Because for the first time since I'd left him, I wasn't entirely sure I'd won. 2 days after my meeting with Daniel, I was sitting in the corner office of a glass tower overlooking the Hudson, finishing a call with my legal team. The Singapore deal was nearly finalized. A strategic partnership that would give my company a foothold in Asia and open the door to 6 more opportunities. I didn't run the kind of business that landed in glossy magazines, but in the corporate world people knew my name, and more importantly, they knew my results. As I ended the call, my assistant stepped in. "Mrs. Blake, there's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." I frowned. "Who?" Before she could answer, Daniel stepped through the door. He looked out of place in my office, not because he didn't belong in a corporate setting, but because for the first time he wasn't the one commanding the space. "Emily," he said, glancing around. "Nice view." I leaned back in my chair. "What do you want, Daniel?" He closed the door behind him, taking a slow step toward my desk. "I had a meeting this morning. Carter Investments is considering a major acquisition, a logistics company. Guess whose name came up in the negotiations?" I kept my expression neutral. "Enlighten me." "Yours," he said. "Apparently the controlling stake is owned by a holding company, which you own." I didn't respond right away. Let him sit with it. Daniel gave a short laugh, but there was no humor in it. "So that's your game. You're not just Adrian's wife. You're in the deals. You're the one making moves." I folded my hands on the desk. "I've been making moves for years, Daniel. You just never cared to notice." He shook his head, still processing. "You could kill this deal for me." I tilted my head slightly. I could. For a moment, the mask slipped, and I saw something raw in his eyes, the realization that I had the power to impact his world in a way he couldn't control. But this wasn't about revenge for me, not exactly. It was about balance. "I'm not in the business of sinking ships just to watch them drown," I said finally. "But I am in the business of making sure the captains know who's really steering the course." Daniel leaned forward, resting his hands on my desk. "You think you've outgrown me, but you wouldn't be here without me." I met his gaze, steady. I'm here despite you. He straightened, his jaw tight. If you block this deal, I cut him off. Daniel, you're not hearing me. This isn't about the deal. It's about the fact that I'm not the woman you left. You can't talk about me like I peaked at 30 when I'm standing here in a position you can't touch. There was a knock at the door. Adrian stepped in, his presence filling the room effortlessly. Everything okay here? Just a business discussion, I said smoothly. Adrian glanced at Daniel, then back at me. Should I stay? No, I said. Daniel was just leaving. Daniel's eyes flicked between us, calculating. This isn't over, he said quietly. I smiled faintly. It is for me. When he was gone, Adrian closed the door and came to stand beside my desk. He's rattled, he observed. Good, I said, though my voice was softer than I intended. But I'm not done yet. Later that week, the charity from the gala reached out to invite me to sit on their advisory board. It was a position Daniel had held for years, one of his pride points, something he liked to mention in every speech. When I asked why they wanted me, the director was candid. We were impressed by your contribution and your professional background. We think you'd bring fresh perspective. I accepted without hesitation. The announcement went public the next morning. The press release was brief but pointed. Emily Blake, CEO of Blake Global Strategies, joins Carter Foundation Advisory Board. By noon, my inbox was full. Old acquaintances congratulated me, industry contacts offered partnerships, and buried among the messages was one from Daniel. You're playing a dangerous game. But it wasn't a game to me. It was the culmination of years of rebuilding. Proof that I didn't just survive without him. I thrived. That evening, Adrian and I attended a small fundraising dinner. I knew Daniel would be there, and that the news of my appointment would be fresh in everyone's minds. The moment we walked in, I felt the shift in the room. People approached me first, not Daniel. They asked about my work, my strategies, my vision. Adrian stood by, proud but silent, letting me take the spotlight. Daniel arrived late. When he finally approached, his smile was tight, his handshake a fraction too firm. Congratulations on the board seat, he said, his voice low enough for only me to hear. Thank you, I replied. I'm looking forward to working together. His eyes narrowed slightly. We'll see how long that lasts. I held his gaze. As long as it needs to. We both knew what that meant, and what it didn't. I wasn't there to undermine him directly, but I wasn't going to let him rewrite the narrative again. Not this time. As the evening went on, I watched him from across the room. He was still charming, still magnetic, but there was a stiffness to his posture, a shadow in his expression. And for the first time since our divorce, I saw it. The faintest crack in his certainty. Because now, Daniel didn't just have to live with the fact that I'd moved on. He had to live with the fact that I was standing beside him at the very tables he once thought he owned. And sometimes, I was the one at the head. Transformation isn't just about changing how you look, it's about changing how you carry yourself when you walk into a room. In the weeks after joining the Carter Foundation Advisory Board, I threw myself into work. Not to prove something to Daniel, though I knew he was watching, but to prove to myself that I could lead at the highest level without bending to anyone's expectations. I began my mornings with a discipline I'd never had in my 20s. Early workouts, business strategy calls, studying global markets over coffee. Adrian called it warrior mode. I called it survival. But it wasn't just business. I started meeting with a stylist who specialized in building what she called an unshakable presence. It wasn't about wearing the most expensive thing in the store. It was about choosing clothes that told the story I wanted people to believe before I even opened my mouth. Gone were the borrowed dresses from my days with Daniel. Now, every piece was mine, tailored to my body in colors that projected strength without shouting. Deep emerald greens, strong blacks, crisp whites, and always something unexpected. A detail that made people look twice, like a bold cuff bracelet or a sharp-shouldered jacket. I invested in my voice too. A speech coach helped me strip away the uncertainty that used to creep in when I spoke in front of a crowd. I learned how to pause, to let silence work for me, instead of rushing to fill it. The first real test of this new presence came sooner than I expected. The Carter Foundation scheduled its quarterly strategy meeting, and for the first time, I would be in the same room as Daniel in an official capacity. Not as his wife, not as his opponent at a gala, but as his peer. The morning of the meeting, I stood in front of the mirror, fastening a pair of simple diamond studs. Adrian watched from the doorway. "You look like you own the place," he said. I met his eyes in the mirror. "That's the idea." The boardroom was all glass and steel, with a sweeping view of the city. I walked in right on time, not a minute early or late, and took my seat at the table. Daniel was already there, mid-conversation with another board member. His words trailed off when he saw me, but his expression didn't falter. "Emily," he said evenly, as if greeting a colleague he barely knew. "Daniel," I replied, matching his tone. The meeting began, and I waited, listening as others spoke. When it was my turn, I outlined a proposal for expanding the Foundation's education initiatives into rural communities. I didn't rush. I didn't over-explain. I let the data speak, then looked around the table, making eye contact with each member. When I finished, the chairman nodded thoughtfully. "It's ambitious," he said, "but it's solid. I think we should explore it further." I caught the flicker in Daniel's eyes, a mix of surprise and something else he was trying to hide. After the meeting, a few board members approached me to say they were impressed. Daniel lingered near the coffee station, watching but not approaching. That night, as I changed into something more casual at home, I realized I felt lighter. Not because I'd outshone Daniel in that meeting, though I knew I had, but because for the first time I didn't feel like I was performing. I was just me, the real me. Over the next month, that feeling grew. I started speaking at industry panels, attending international summits with Adrian, and even mentoring a few young women in business. I could see the narrative shifting. I wasn't Daniel's ex-wife anymore. I was Emily Blake, a name that stood on its own. Still, I knew the final chapter hadn't been written. Daniel hadn't tried to undermine me directly yet, but I could sense it coming. Men like him didn't accept being outpaced quietly. The opportunity for the final act arrived in the form of the Carter Foundation's Spring Benefit, a televised event, broadcast live to millions. This year, the centerpiece would be a joint presentation by the advisory board and executive leadership. The lineup put me and Daniel side by side on stage. When I saw the program, I almost laughed. It was too perfect. In the days leading up to the benefit, I worked with my team to prepare my portion of the speech. It would be concise, powerful, and impossible to overshadow. I didn't tell Adrian the details, not because I wanted to keep him in the dark, but because I wanted him to see it fresh, the way everyone else would. The night of the event, I dressed in a sleek black gown with a single emerald pendant, the same green I'd worn the first time I walked into the gala with Adrian. A subtle reminder of how far I'd come. As Adrian and I stepped onto the red carpet, the flash of cameras was blinding. Reporters called my name as often as his, a small but significant victory. Inside, the ballroom buzzed with anticipation. I spotted Daniel across the room, greeting donors with that same polished charm. Our eyes met briefly. No smile, no nod, just the quiet acknowledgement that tonight would be another test. Backstage, moments before we went on, Daniel leaned slightly toward me. "Don't try to upstage me," he murmured. I looked straight ahead. "I don't need to try." The host announced us, and we stepped into the spotlight. The applause washed over us, but I barely heard it. My focus was on the moment, on owning every second I had in front of that audience. Daniel spoke first, delivering his usual polished lines about legacy and leadership. He was good, he always had been, but tonight his words felt rehearsed, safe. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward, letting the pause settle before I spoke. I talked about the Foundation's future, about using its influence to create opportunities for those who'd been overlooked, because I knew what it was like to be overlooked. I shared a personal story about growing up in a small town, about the teachers who'd believed in me when I had nothing but potential to my name. The room was silent, hanging on every word. When I finished, the applause was louder than his had been. Not a competition, but still. I noticed, and so did he. And as we left the stage, I knew the next move would be mine, and it would end this story on my terms. The Spring Benefits live broadcast was watched by over 3 million people, and I knew this was my moment. Not just to speak, but to reclaim the narrative for good. After the joint presentation, the program moved into the live auction. Daniel had been chosen to host it, a role he'd held for years. It was a chance for him to show off his charm, to control the spotlight, and, historically, to edge out anyone who might steal it. This year, things would go differently. I'd worked quietly with the foundation staff on a surprise auction lot, a fully funded scholarship program for underprivileged students, with seed money already committed by Blake Global Strategies, my company. The announcement would be timed to land right after one of Daniel's big-ticket items, ensuring the comparison was inevitable. Daniel was in his element at the podium, taking bids for a luxury yacht vacation. The numbers climbed fast. 200,000, 250, 300. The hammer came down at 325,000. The room applauded, Daniel smiling like the king of the world. Then the MC took the mic. And now, in addition to tonight's program, a new lot introduced by our very own Emily Blake. The shift in the room was palpable. Cameras turned. Daniel's smile froze just enough for me to see it. I walked up to the stage, every step deliberate. The lights were bright, but I could feel the audience leaning in. "This isn't just another auction item," I began. "This is an investment in futures that might otherwise be lost." I explained the scholarship program, how it would cover not just tuition but housing, books, and mentorship. The things that make the difference between surviving college and thriving in it. I told them about the students I'd already met through my pilot program, young people with dreams bigger than their circumstances. And then I dropped the number. Blake Global Strategies is committing $1 million to launch this initiative. Tonight, I'm inviting you to join us. The room erupted. Hands shot up. Bids came fast, not for luxury items but for the chance to fund something that mattered. 200,000. 400. 600. By the time the last pledge was made, the total had climbed to over $2 million. The applause was deafening. I glanced at Daniel. He was clapping, but his eyes told the real story. Frustration, disbelief, and something else. The awareness that his yacht auction, as successful as it had been, suddenly looked small in comparison. When the noise died down, I handed the mic back to the MC, who announced a brief intermission. Daniel caught me just off stage. "Nice stunt," he said, his voice low. "Not a stunt," I replied. "A statement." He took a step closer. "You made me look like you've been playing small," I finished for him. "Because you have." His jaw tightened. "This is my arena, Emily." I smiled faintly. "Not anymore." Before he could reply, Adrian appeared, placing a steadying hand on my back. "Everything all right here?" "Perfect," I said, and walked away with him. During the intermission, guests came up to congratulate me. Donors asked for details, and the press wanted quotes. Daniel stood on the other side of the room, surrounded by fewer people than usual. Monica was with him, but her expression was strained, her hand on his arm more for stability than show. Back at our table, Adrian leaned in. "You know you just changed how everyone here sees you, right?" "That was the point," I said. When the program resumed, Daniel carried on like nothing had happened, but the shift was undeniable. The whispers in the room were no longer about him. They were about the woman who had walked into his world, and without raising her voice, proven she didn't need his approval or his stage to shine. After the final toast, people began to leave. Adrian excused himself to take a call, and I stepped out into the lobby to collect my wrap. That's when I felt a presence behind me. "Emily," I turned. Daniel stood there, his bow tie loosened, his eyes tired. "You made your point tonight?" he said. "Which one?" I asked. "That you don't need me," he admitted. "That you never did." For a moment, the air between us was heavy with everything unsaid, the years, the hurt, the missed chances. "I hope," I said quietly, "that one day you'll understand the difference between building someone up and holding them back." He nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Maybe I already do." I didn't answer. Some silences say more than words. I stepped outside into the cool night, the city lights bright against the dark sky. Adrian was waiting by the car, his hand outstretched. I took it without hesitation. But as we drove away, I looked back at the hotel one last time. Because I knew the real ending wasn't about humiliating Daniel in public. It was about what I was going to do next, now that the stage was truly mine. The morning after the benefit, the headlines were everywhere. Emily Blake steals the show with multi-million-dollar education initiative. Photos of me at the podium, smiling as I spoke, were splashed across news sites and social media feeds. The caption writers couldn't resist the contrast. Next to every image of me, there was one of Daniel, caught mid-applause, his expression unreadable. Adrian slid a copy of the Wall Street Journal across the breakfast table. "Front page," he said with a grin. I looked at it, letting the reality sink in. I hadn't just had a good night, I'd changed the story. For years, Daniel had shaped the narrative of who I was and what I was worth. Now my own work had done the rewriting. Over the next week, invitations poured in. Conferences, think tanks, universities, they wanted me to speak, to share my perspective. I accepted some, declined others. For the first time, I was choosing my stage, instead of waiting to be invited onto his. And then, unexpectedly, an email from Monica. She wanted to meet. Adrian raised an eyebrow when I told him. "You don't owe her anything." "I know," I said, "but I want to hear what she has to say." We met in a quiet cafe. She arrived looking less polished than usual, her hair pulled back, no camera-ready makeup. "I won't take much of your time," she began. "I just wanted to say I underestimated you." I said nothing, letting her speak. "I thought you were bitter, that everything you did was about getting back at Daniel, but I saw you the other night. That wasn't about him." She hesitated. It made me realize how much of my own life has been about him. For a moment, I saw in her what I'd once seen in myself, a woman dimming her own light to make space for his. "I'm not here to give advice," I said softly, "but you should know, it's not worth it. Shrinking for someone else never is." She nodded, eyes glistening. "Thank you." We left it at that. No promises, no alliances, just a quiet acknowledgement that we were both finding our way out of his shadow. A few days later, the Carter Foundation held its first board meeting since the benefit. Daniel was present but quieter than usual. When it was my turn to speak, I noticed he didn't interrupt, didn't try to redirect the conversation. When the meeting ended, he lingered as others filed out. "Emily," he said finally. I turned, waiting. "I read through your scholarship proposal in detail. It's good work." It wasn't an apology, but it was as close as I was going to get. And in that moment, I realized I didn't need more. "Thank you," I said, and walked away without looking back. That night, Adrian and I celebrated quietly on our balcony. The city stretched out before us. "You know," he said, handing me a glass of wine, "you didn't just win, you rewrote the whole game." I smiled. I didn't do it to win, I did it to stop playing by someone else's rules. The air was warm, the city alive with lights. Somewhere down there, Daniel was probably telling his version of the story to someone new. And that was fine, because his version didn't matter anymore. What mattered was the one I was living. In the months that followed, the scholarship program launched. The first group of students sent me handwritten letters about their dreams, their gratitude, their determination. Reading them, I felt something Daniel had never given me, the sense that my success wasn't just for me. One evening, after a long day, I sat in my office with the lights low, holding one of those letters. It was from a young woman named Ava, who wrote, "I didn't think people like me mattered to people like you. Now I know we do." I thought back to all the years I'd spent thinking I didn't matter unless someone else said I did. And I knew, finally, that those days were over. On the anniversary of the benefit, Adrian and I attended the next gala. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about celebrating what we'd built. When I walked into the room, there were handshakes, smiles, people greeting me by name. Daniel was there, of course, but this time he wasn't the center of gravity. He was just another guest. As I stood at the edge of the room, Adrian beside me, I realized something important. The real victory wasn't in outshining him. It was in no longer caring if I did. The night ended with a speech from the foundation's chairman, thanking donors and announcing the year's achievements. When he mentioned the scholarship program, the applause was loud and genuine. I felt a swell of pride, not the sharp, defensive pride I used to feel, but the kind that warms you from the inside out. Walking out into the night, Adrian slipped his arm around me. "So," he said, "what's next?" I looked ahead, the city lights glittering like 1,000 possibilities. "Anything," I said. "Everything. Because now, I'm not walking into anyone else's story, I'm writing my own." And for the first time in my life, I knew I'd never let anyone else hold the pen again. So the story has ended, my wonderful friends. Are you still here with me right now? If you've stayed until this moment, there's something in your heart, that's been touched in some way. You've seen that true strength isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming your own voice and writing your own story. As an old heterodox saying goes, healing begins when you no longer need them to understand you. Emily's journey reminds us that our worth is never defined by someone else's opinion, and our future belongs to us alone. If this touched you, let's carry that courage into our own lives. Stand tall, speak your truth, and never hand the pen of your story to anyone else. Please, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe so we can keep walking this journey together.